Under OPEC Plus, Saudi Arabia has announced another round of cuts in its oil output, this time by at least 1 million barrels a day. Who will benefit and who will lose out from this policy? The 2023 Gender Social Norms Index released by UNDP highlights that biased gender social norms are a major impediment to gender equality and women empowerment. There's no news in that, but what makes this data relevant? And with the French Open tournament concluding this week, we take a look at the major takeaways for its champions. Welcome to Daily Debrief. I'm your host Shriya, and these are the stories for the day. Saudi Arabia has said it will cut its oil supply to the global economy by 1 million barrels per day. The new cuts in oil supply, which are planned from July onwards, have been announced in addition to earlier cuts announced by the OPEC and its allied countries. The OPEC Plus alliance, which met in Vienna earlier this month, reached a deal on output policy after 7 hours of talks at its headquarters and agreed to extend earlier cuts in supplies through the end of 2024 by a further total of 1.4 million barrels per day. How will this decision impact oil prices around the globe? We ask Abdul Rahman, who joins us in studio. Welcome back to the show, Abdul. So, the first question that comes to mind is, what can be the possible reasons that have led to these cuts being announced by Saudi?
Well, it is quite obvious given the fact that the global economy is predicted to go into some kind of recession. The growth rate of the major economy, if you see China, US and other European economies, including even India, the developing world, is not very bright in the coming days. And that is basically will lead to, it is the speculation that it will lead to the kind of reduction in demands, or the demands will not grow as much as it is expected. So that basically will lead to the fall in the oil prices, and OPEC, most of the OPEC countries, primarily the Saudi Arabia, is heavily dependent on the oil revenues for its economy. As per the IMF predictions, IMF's calculations, it needs at least $80 per day, $80 per barrel oil prices to sustain its economy, the way the economy is. And if you see the current oil prices, it is less than $80 per barrel. And that basically Saudi and other OPEC countries, oil producing countries, think that this is not sustainable for their economy. The prices, if they go low, they have, of course, they will be in the loss. And therefore, that is the reason, that is the rationale behind this. This is the fourth cut announced in last couple of months. And that is basically, that is the reason behind it.
Right. And Abdul, how are these cuts likely to impact, you mentioned this already, the developing economies, and because these come in addition to existing cuts already. So, yeah.
If you see the prices have not gone higher after the announcement was made. The announcement of reduction of 1 million per day is a huge reduction, and this comes over and above what has been already decided of in last few months. The OPEC has decided to cut around 3.6 million barrels per day overall, altogether, all the countries, including Russia, which is the part of the OPEC Plus initiative. And if you see the oil production in Russia is already low because of the sanctions, various kinds of sanctions imposed on it. Iran is not exploiting its full potential. There are countries like Venezuela and other countries out of the West Asia, which also are part of the, in some way, the larger part of the oil producing countries, and their production is not as much as it ideally should be. Despite all that, the oil prices have not gone up, primarily because there is a lack in demand. And given the fact that the demand is not going to increase further in the coming few months, by the way, the OPEC has extended the year when these cuts will end, which was, the deadline was 2023, end of the 2023. Now it has been extended one more year. Yeah. And that basically means that they are expecting that the global slowdown will continue for another year at least. So given that this larger context of slowing down of the global economies, the cut in the oil production will not have much impact on the oil prices. This is a larger attempt to stabilize the prices, not to kind of increase it. And it seems, given the current trends, it seems that this will likely be the case in the near future as well. So it will, by and large, will maintain the status quo as far as the prices are concerned until the countries outside the OPEC decide to increase their production, which may lead to the fall in the prices, which US has tried to do in the past and basically impacting its quote-unquote strategic reserves. But we are not in a position at this moment to say that the other countries will follow the examples of US. US has tried to convince Saudi Arabia time and again to not announce such cuts in the oil production, but we know that Saudi Arabia has not agreed, primarily because it is not in their interest. If the prices go further low, the Saudi economy will suffer, and apart from Saudi economy, other regional economies will also suffer. So I think that is all which we can see at this moment.
And Abdul, you just mentioned how Saudi has refused to comply to these requests made by the United States to not make these cuts. Is Saudi trying to hint at a changing alliance it's taking towards Russia in the Ukraine-Russia war?
Well, it will be too much of a reading to say that what Saudi Arabia is doing is primarily going and aligning with Russia, justifying the war, and so on and so forth. It basically primarily it is the economic interest of Saudi Arabia, which basically does not align with what US is demanding from Saudi Arabia. As we discussed earlier, Saudi Arabia is primarily dependent on oil revenues for its economic sustenance, and the kind of project which MBS Mohammed bin Salman has been taking about Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia, the kind of infrastructure projects it has undertaken, it needs a lot of monetary investment, and that primarily comes from the oil production and the prices of the oil. If they go down further, all those projects will be hampered. Will be hampered. So it is more of the domestic consideration and the consideration of the regional economy in general, which basically has other countries also in part of the OPEC Plus alliance have agreed with this particular strategy because they also need the revenues. So it is not about whether they are aligning with Russia or it is about Ukraine or something. It is primarily the domestic economic consideration which is forcing most of the oil producing countries to behave the way they are behaving.
Thank you for joining us today, Abdul. Thank you so much. The United Nations Development Programme released the 2023 Gender Social Norms Index this week, which reveals that there has been no improvement in biases against women in a decade, with almost 9 out of 10 men and women worldwide still holding such biases today. The report argues that these biases drive hurdles faced by women, manifested in a dismantling of women's rights in many parts of the world, with movements against gender equality gaining traction and in some countries a surge of human rights violations. What is the relevance of this research and its data, and for whom? Anna Vrasha of People's Health Movement joins us to discuss. Welcome to the show, Anna. So the Gender Social Norms Index, can you tell us something about this, the details of this report first off, and how does one understand a report like this in context of similar other reports when it comes to women and their participation in the workforce, their health, something on that?
Yeah, sure. So, we have seen a number of reports that talk about, actually they underline what we have known for quite a bit of time, that, that gender inequalities persist in different aspects of society. And this latest UN report goes along the lines of that. So in very short lines, what it shows is that essentially gender bias persists in different aspects. So it persists when we talk about education. It persists if we talk about political activism and political representation. And it essentially shows that many people, a majority of people even in the world, still consider women to be somewhat inferior to men when it comes to different aspects of participation in life. at the same time, it shows also that we still know that women are still shouldering the most of the care activities in the world, and that essentially the situation remains the same as for many, many decades, as we have seen these reports printed and published. Now, the UN report, of course, because it's a UN report, it talks a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals and how the situation that we are seeing now actually will impact achieving the Sustainable Development Goals that have something to do with gender equality. Now, on the other hand, what we know and what we have seen from other reports for now is that essentially, while we do have better and better data to show how gender inequalities affect people, affect women, it's more important to see what kind of action needs to be taken, because in some cases it has been shown that while the data is there, the action is not there, and so essentially it's not useful. I mean, it is useful in the long-term perspective because researchers and activists get the tools to advocate more for what they want. But if governments are not taking any action on that, then we have a problem. And that's something that I think we have discussed even here before, when it comes to various reports that, for example, tackle how international financial institutions approach gender inequalities, for example, the IMF. It shows that this data about inequality that we have is being used to pinkwash, let's say, some of the agency's own activities and own policies. So a report that was published by Public Services International and others at the end of 2022 actually shows that the IMF, while it has a gender mainstreaming strategy, whatever that is, actually harms women and women workers around the world by pushing the kind of policies that it pushes usually.
Right. And while we're trying to understand this report, Anna, another question would be, whom does this kind of a report target, or whom does it cater to?
I think that's a very interesting question, actually, because it essentially, it again shows how this data that is being collected and analyzed can be used in different ways. Of course, ideally, it would be taken up by governments who would then use the data to actually make policies that address the problems the report underlines. But what we're seeing actually is a different trend, and I think that's quite worrisome, because it actually shows that the industry is taking up this data and using it to either improve its image in the public, or on the other hand, actually to make even more profits. So here I think we can safely make the example of women's health, for example, because we know that historically women's health has been treated as less important than men's. So it's actually been more difficult for women to access quality healthcare, the kind of healthcare they need, because all the research and development has been focused on how men experience disease. And this has meant that, now we have drugs which have been tested on men. Maybe we don't know if the effects are different in women, or if they target all the needs that women have when it comes to health. And this is something that I think we can talk about in this context as well, because we're seeing that, the industry has really, so the pharma industry, the tech industry, a lot of niches are involved here. So essentially what they're doing is they're saying, okay, there has been this great gender inequality. It's been so unfair. So let's focus on women now. And what they're doing is actually marketing products that are made for women, but that are essentially leaving behind a lot of women who are left behind in the first place. So, it's an approach oriented towards middle or even high middle class women who have specific needs. The women who cannot afford healthcare in the first place, they have very, very little use of the great advances that the tech is claiming to be making in women's health today. So that's something that I think we should keep an eye out for when we talk about this kind of report. Again, it's important to have them out. It's important to know that international agencies are trying to underline what is definitely a great problem in practice. But what we are really missing is the action being taken on those reports, and the action should definitely not be taken by industry. It should be taken by the governments.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Anna, and for your insights on this report. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
On Sunday, June 11, as the French Open came to an end, Novak Djokovic may have scored a historic 23rd Grand Slam title, becoming the sole leader on the Grand Slam charts among men's. A day earlier, the world number one from Poland, Iga Swiatek, claimed the championship, winning her third French Open title in women's singles category. We go to Siddhant Annie for more interesting details on the closing of this tournament. Hi Siddhant, thanks for joining us. So we'll talk about Djokovic's 23rd Grand Slam title a little bit later. But first, can you tell us a little bit about the women's single and how was the final game, how it played out?
I think between the two finals, it was, in a sense, the closer run of the two. Iga Swiatek, by most accounts, the favorite to kind of win that final over the unseeded Mukova, who she was playing, who came back actually quite brilliantly to beat Arina Sabalenka in the semis and make it to the final in the first place. So a three-set affair there, but in the end, Swiatek, I think, establishing for us that she is now potentially, I mean, she is a great tennis player, of course, but also in terms of her Grand Slam record, she's now moved into the state of great players at the age of 22 with her fourth Grand Slam title, three of which have happened at the French Open. It was the first Grand Slam that she won back when she was just 19, first year out of high school. And actually, a few weeks before that first French Open title, Swiatek had kind of almost called time on a very short, sort of very fledgling career. She just couldn't handle, the mental pressure and all of that going into it. Of course, this was also just before the COVID-19 pandemic. But eventually, 2 weeks later, she played the French Open and won the French Open for the first time. And has since then, of course, some of the struggles continued. It's not that the pressures of playing on the tour get any easier as you win. In fact, in many senses, the expectations and all of those lead to a much greater mental stress. Also, you have to play at a much higher level more consistently. So all of that also plays a major role. But Swiatek, yesterday in Paris, quite clearly establishing, perhaps, before when the tournament began, we were saying how open the women's draw is compared to the men's, where Novak Djokovic was always the person to beat, and everyone else, all the youngsters in the draw, were sort of the pretenders to his crown. But in the women's scene, it was a lot more open. But Swiatek now kind of establishing that she is a great a tennis great to be remembered in the present, but also for the future, and also, of course, comparable now in many ways with players from the past.
Right, and this particular title that Djokovic has won is being deemed very significant, and comparisons are being made to Rafael Nadal. So what would you want to say about that?
Yeah, it's his 23rd, so he is now one ahead of Nadal. Nadal is a couple of years older than Djokovic, and seems like has some serious injury issues. Of course, the French Open is Nadal has won 10 of those. Nadal probably has the greatest probability of, in that sense, making a successful comeback, which means another year he will have to wait to mount a serious sort of challenge, try and catch up with Djokovic now. But in a couple of weeks, Wimbledon starts, and Djokovic has won 4 titles at Wimbledon as well. So when that tournament begins, he'll have a chance to make it 24 to match up to Serena Williams as and in that sense become the most winning tennis player from either of the two sexes once Wimbledon kicks off. So And the way he played yesterday against Casper Ruud of Norway uh, kind of underlined how the kind of physical shape he's in, and the kind of mental state he's in as well. Because there were a couple of moments there, particularly in the first set, when Ruud was really pushing or attempting to push at least. But when it came down to the tiebreaker in the first set, Djokovic seemed to just put his machine into a different gear and completely dominated that first set tiebreak. I think winning 7-1 in the tiebreak itself. Just totally leveling up and not giving the young Norwegian actually any chance from then on to kind of seriously threaten or mount any kind of serious comeback. So despite being 36 years old and the oldest champion at the French Open now, clearly it's both the combination of where he is physically as well as mentally. We won't get into Djokovic's personal politics for the purpose of this conversation. So yeah, we'll maybe talk about that the next time he enters the tournament, because he'll for sure give us some fodder on that front as well. But just physically and mentally, as far as his performance on the court is concerned, I think for the year to come, and maybe even going the next couple of years, once again he's underlined or put himself in as the person to beat on the men's tennis circuit. I believe this was his 93rd or 94th overall title on the ATP tour. So I mean, the GOAT debate obviously goes on. It's an individual sport, and in that sense, it's an ever-present conversation. So with Roger Federer having retired and Nadal seemingly on his last legs physically, Djokovic now has a chance to push forward and put himself firmly in that position, at least in terms of winning the most Grand Slams, and therefore having the most legitimate claim from that perspective to the title of greatest tennis player, greatest men's tennis player at least of all time.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Siddhant. And that's all we have for today. For more such stories, keep watching peoplesdispatch.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.